welcome. My name's Brian Caplen, editor of the Banker magazine. We're at the end of the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF, held this year in Tokyo, Japan. We've had 20,000 delegates here. Unfortunately, no one from China. That was a result of the dispute going on between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands. But a lot of vigorous debate about the state of the economy. And of course, top of the list of worries has been the Eurozone. Now, I'm here with Silvia Pavoni, who's investment editor of the Banker, one of a team of 4 editors that we've had here at the meetings. And Silvia, you've been talking to the chief executive in Intesa Bank. What's his view about the prospects for resolution in the Eurozone crisis?
Well, as traditionally all CEOs are, he has an optimistic outlook towards this whole situation, but obviously the Eurozone crisis is still kind of far from being resolved. He has been talking about banking union and how that is a first step towards obviously fiscal union within the Eurozone.
And does you think a banking union is something that's going to come about in the short term, or is it going to be a much longer term project?
Interesting, he took part at a panel discussion at the IMF, and there was a question that ended that discussion. The question was, are we going to have banking union by 2020? Now, for some people, the answer was yes. For Mr. Cucchiani, the CEO of Intesa, the answer was, well, hopefully it's going to happen way before then. But in a colorful turn of phrase, he actually described it as a tango. So which is led 2 steps forward, 1 backwards, and this is how we are progressing at the moment.
Okay, well, on the note of tango, you also cover Latin America, and I'm sure you've been talking to people from the region. There has been some concerns about build-up in some of the debt in some of the emerging market economies, for example, credit creation and NPLs in Brazil.
Yes.
Have you had a reaction from anybody about that?
Well, the level of NPLs in Brazil, which spiked since 2011, seems to have leveled off at the moment, which is obviously encouraging, and that could help banks to relax their cautious stance on lending. The ratio of credit to GDP in Brazil is still relatively low compared to other countries in Latin America, so the situation hopefully is not going to be as worrisome as some are seen at the moment. But the issue of over-leveraging is definitely something that emerging markets have been advised to keep an eye on.
Now, the other thing that's been going on in the last sort of 10 years or so is the development of economic relationships between major emerging market areas, what we're calling now South-South trade and dialogue. So there's been a lot of business there. There's been discussion about even having a South-South development bank.
Yes.
So have you got any reaction from people here at the IMF meetings about how that might turn out?
That is still very much a buzzword, so you can actually see people getting excited as soon as you mention the South-South relations. So Asia, Latin America is one of these very strong relations, both in terms of trade flows and in terms of investments. Banks are obviously chasing their clients that are dealing, the Brazilians, Latin Americans with Asia, and the other way around. So we've seen a number of, for example, Chinese banks setting up presence in Latin America, in Brazil, in Argentina, and in other countries. And obviously they start with the view of helping their national clients expanding and setting up a presence in another continent. But with time, I'm sure they will start competing to get clients in the target country. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to witness, how that's going to shape up competition internationally.
Okay, well, we'll watch that with interest. Okay, thank you very much, Silvia. Very interesting to hear about the challenges that are going on in Latin America and the ties that are being built between different parts of what we used to call the emerging world in this sort of new structure of South-South trade. But meanwhile, you know, things are still happening in the advanced countries, and we've seen huge developments of shale oil and gas in the United States. I'm now going to talk to Paul Wallace, who's the Africa editor, but who recently wrote a big story about shale energy for the Banker magazine.
Yes, there's been huge development in the shale energy market in the US in the last 5 years. The US today is now the fastest growing oil producer in the world, and it is awash with very, very cheap gas prices. They're about 1/5 of the price that gas prices in the States are about 1/5 of the price that they are in Japan, and about 1/3 of the price that they are in Europe. So this could have huge implications. The US still has a lot of shale energy that's untapped, and people now think, the mainstream view is that probably within 5 years the US will be all but energy independent. It will be able to produce all that it needs, and along with imports.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, while I've been here, I actually heard or read a report where an analyst was kind of turning conventional logic on its head. So, you know, we've kind of got used to the idea now that this is going to be China's century, and that China is going to rule the world in terms of economic growth and manufacturing output. But given the combination of shale oil and gas in the United States, together with the developments in manufacturing, where you see the development of sort of 3D manufacturing and able to do it in kind of little sort of batches to order, rather than the large-scale economies of scale type of manufacturing that China does, you know, I mean, do you think there's any possibility that we're going to see much stronger growth in America than we've actually been led to believe?
There's a good chance, and if America gets its shale energy policies correct, it has huge benefits for the rest of the economy. Millions of jobs are expected to be created in the US, either directly because of shale drilling or because of petrochemical companies moving plants from where they previously thought there was cheap energy, like Qatar and other places in the Middle East, back to America, where that is now seen as the source of cheap energy. So the advantages are huge, and the Americans are actually, some of them are quite aghast that places like Europe are so anti things such as hydraulic fracturing or fracking
that you need for the process.
Exactly, and they can't understand why other places don't develop.
Now, Paul, you also cover Africa for the Banker. So what sort of things have we been hearing from the African delegates to the IMF meetings? I gather they're very worried about the Eurozone crisis and how it might impact on their own economies.
They are. Africa is still one of the fastest growing regions in the world, depending which way you look at it, and many countries in the sub-Saharan part are growing at 6%, 7%, 8%, but they are concerned about the Eurozone crisis and how that's going to impact their economies, because it's partly because of exports. Europe is still the biggest export market for Europe, and countries like Rwanda, whose finance minister we interviewed earlier, have said that while their exports are still growing, they're slowing down, and that's mostly because of what's happening in Europe. But it's also to do with portfolio investment in bonds and equities. The majority of portfolio investors in Africa come from Europe. They may indirectly come from Asia and other places, but they basically originate from Europe. And
so it's important, really, in a global economy that, you know, all the parts are functioning correctly. True. Otherwise, you have these knock-on effects. And you've just returned from South Africa. South Africa's been under particular pressure recently, and some of the rating agencies have downgraded it. So what's your kind of take on the outlook for a big economy like South Africa, which is crucial to the whole continent?
South Africa's outlook at the moment is pretty bleak. It's growing at 2.5%, which is very slow by African standards, and it's got huge problems with labour unrest and strikes in not just its mining sector, but in plenty of some other sectors as well of the economy. And these two downgrades in the last month by Standard & Poor's and Moody's are not going to help at all. Okay. Since the worst of the problems in mid-August, when 34 miners were shot dead by South African police, the rand and the capital markets in South Africa have been pretty resilient, but we're starting to see signs now that foreign investors are becoming nervous about the country, and they are deciding either not to invest in South Africa or maybe pull out. And it's a problem. South Africa will probably, within as short a time as 5 years, be overtaken by Nigeria as the biggest economy on the continent. And while South Africa might say publicly that that's in some ways inevitable and that it doesn't matter so much, it
hurts their pride.
And the fact that it's happening so quickly is a result of the problems of South Africa.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Well, you can see from that account of the challenges that South Africa faces, you know, this really is a global crisis, and it's beginning to affect the emerging markets as well as the advanced countries. So I'm now going to speak with Melissa Hancock. She's the Middle East editor for the Banker.
Yes, I mean, the Middle East region is also feeling the effects of the Eurozone crisis. I mean, although it's often held up as a very resilient region, it's a lot of the economies are driven by oil, and the slowdown in oil demand from the US and the Eurozone is inevitably impacting their GDP and their overall growth. So from the Middle Eastern central bank governors and finance ministers I've spoken to while I've been here in Tokyo, they've all cited that as a key concern, the slowdown in demand for oil and the volatility that gives the
One of the other key things about oil, of course, is what happens in Iraq, Iran and Libya. Have you got any sort of feel for what we might see in terms of output production from those key oil producers?
Yeah, well, the IMF's just actually forecast a contraction in Iran's oil production this year, 0.9%, which is going to be the first economic contraction the country will have posted since 1994.
Yeah.
And obviously the country's been subjected to economic sanctions before. I mean, it's what's happening today is a combination of factors. It's the Eurozone crisis, it's the international sanctions, it's everything. But that's pretty big news. Libya. They've now forecast overall growth of 6.6% for the MENA region oil exporting economies because Libya is ramping up its oil production. So, you can see everywhere how much of a key driver oil production is in these countries. And obviously, yes, Iraq is also massively increasing its oil production, and so those are key drivers.
All right, and obviously the Middle East is a very sort of varied region, so we have the problems, political problems in a country like Syria, but in the Gulf it's all rather different, isn't it? I mean, there's still a massive amount of infrastructure spending going on there, especially in Qatar, where you're building up to these big World Cup and so forth. Did you talk to anybody in the Gulf region about what's happening?
I mean, Qatar and Saudi Arabia they're having huge infrastructure expenditure programs, huge construction booms, which are carrying their economies forward, regardless of what's happening around them. But people are very, very positive on the growth prospects for those countries. And then, different countries around the Gulf vary. I mean, they've each got their, the UAE is picking up its growth in some areas, but it's still slow on other fronts. Bahrain is feeling the impact of the Arab Spring, and that's something a lot of people have said to me, is that the region is experiencing such historic changes.
Yes.
The changes that are taking place are just they're spilling over into every country. You can't be insulated from it, and how all the countries need to pull together and share knowledge and learn from each other's experiences, and share knowledge in the education space, services, banking and finance sector as well. I mean, a country like Libya is really liberalising its banking sector now and opening it up and introducing Islamic finance, and there are real growth opportunities for the banking sector in a lot of countries for the first time in many years.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Well, at least we ended there on a positive note in talking about growth opportunities. But clearly there are big challenges ahead. The Managing Director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, has talked about the things being a marathon, not a sprint, in terms of fiscal consolidation. So it will be a long haul, I think, before world economic growth returns to what we might call normal levels.